Welcome to this series of lectures on early Indian economy, and in the initial part of this lecture, this is of course a sequel to it. We discussed about the Mauryan period, the state of economy during the Mauryan period, and Mauryan period, as you would understand, roughly corresponds with, say, 4th century BCE to around the end of the 2nd century BCE, 180 BCE to be more precise. And this is the period that we have been talking about in terms of economic changes. In the earlier part, of course, we have spoken about several other stages of early Indian economy, including the one preceding the Mauryan period, which is 6th century BCE, North India, and the associated changes with reference to urbanization, coinage, entry of rice cultivation or rice transplantation, and so forth. Now, as we discussed in the previous part of this lecture, that the trajectory of change that we get to see having initiated from around the end of the later Vedic period, around the middle of the first millennium BC, that continues unabated. In fact, it gets intensified during the Mauryan period, and the Mauryan period acquires a distinction of its own with reference to economy, because there is an overriding presence of the state in regulating and supervising economic activities, be it agriculture, be it trade, be it industry, and so forth. Of course, in the previous part, we also discussed that there are contrarian viewpoints emerging in the last 30-40 years that argues to the contrary and argues against very acute, bureaucratized, centralized image that is sought to be projected by a uncritical reading of Kautilya's Arthashastra or Megasthenes' Indica, and so forth. But presently, we are continuing with that trajectory of discussion where reasons are cited, compulsions are cited in support of the Mauryan period, being labeled as the one where the Mauryan state is having a overriding presence and is regulating, is managing almost every aspect of economic activities. So we were talking of those compulsions. We spoke of huge army officials, their nature being standing army, so they had to be paid in cash. And the salaries were also very impressive from the perspective of the period that we are talking of. And yet another Mauryan specificity in governance with reference to maintaining a buffer stock in terms of exchequer, in terms of money for emergencies. And that's what we continue discussing here, that this buffer for emergencies necessitated the state to tax people over and beyond the conventional normal, which was Shadbhag. So conventionally, if you read the texts, early Indian texts belonging to the period prior to the Mauryan period, it is Shadbhag that the state is supposed to levy as tax, 1/6 of the produce. But in the Mauryan times, certainly it seemed that there were several other taxes, and certainly the burden of tax was manyfold, many times more than merely being 1/6. So, under the compulsion, the twin compulsion of maintaining its state apparatus, army and bureaucracy, and the policy of maintaining buffer stock for emergencies, which is, of course, a face of welfareist state, Mauryans needed to have more control and regulation of economic activities, because after all, it is from there that they have to draw revenue and taxes. So the state undertook and regulated numerous economic activities through a vast network of bureaucracy of superintendents, lower officials and subordinate staff, and there are some 30 odd departments that are mentioned in the contemporary sources, and we shall some of them we shall be talking about. Over and above that, there is yet another noticeable thing that we get to see during the Mauryan period as part of state policy, and that is the policy of founding new settlements and rehabilitating the decaying settlements. How? By grafting surplus settlers from overpopulated areas to areas that are sparsely populated, where agriculture is not done in any big scale. So, state is making effort to populate those areas so that people in increasing number take to agricultural activities or other economic activities. Why? So that in future, and this inducement is some kind of a initial immunity from state taxation or revenue generation from those areas. So anyone who goes there over a period of time, starts doing agriculture or other economic activities, over a long period of time, that areas develops that capacity to generate extra income, so that the state apparatus can then go and graft itself over it to extract something as tax. Now, this policy is referred to as Janapada Nivesh or Shunya Nivesh. This, in contemporary terms, you can understand as something akin to, say, special economic zones, where the state even today induces investors to go and invest in areas where not enough industrial activities or other economic activities have taken place. So that's not a natural area of attraction for investors. So state induces the investors to go there by making them immune from taxes in the initial years, in the initial decades, and when capacity building is done, subsequently the state starts extracting its share of tax from those areas. Now, since Mauryans were following this policy as well, therefore, there is additional pressure on the state to regulate economic activity. So, this is the context in which we spoke about these things. Now, when historians talk of state regulation of economic activities, of course, agriculture is the most important. So, does it gel well with the evidences that we have for agriculture, and what is the level of intrusion of the state in managing agriculture and extracting taxes from there? In the period preceding the Mauryan period that we have spoken of in earlier lectures, we get references like agricultural fields or farms where more than 500 or 1000 karishas are working, and they probably are owned by the landowners, and these workers are either hired laborers or they could even be slaves. Some historians have written about their being slaves as well. And that model is now making transition to the Mauryan times, where now it is said that it is the state farms that are working under the supervision of Sita Dhyaksha. So, instead of the private rich landholders, now it is the state that has become the new manager or supervisor or overseer of these agricultural activities. To what extent this is tenable is something that is questioned by historians. To what extent we can assume that the agrarian labor here involved in these large farms are hired laborers, or can we call them slaves? Megasthenes says there was no slavery in India, and yet, so this is still a kind of debated thing. What was the nature of the labor deployed in these state farms? Were they free? Were they wage laborers and so forth, or can we call them slaves, etc.? So, moving beyond this, Megasthenes also gives us detailed account of officials who are described as measuring irrigation sluices, land perhaps measured as they were measured in Egypt by these officials. And remember, we are talking of the 2nd century, 3rd century BCE. Kautilya further says that irrigation cess amounted to 1/5 or 1/4 or even 1/3 of the produce of the irrigated soil. So are we talking of the hydraulic theory of state control as proposed by Wittefogel and so forth? So these are the ways in which historians have sought to make sense of these references. They could be off the mark, but to the extent they gel well with several other evidence that we have for the period, it can perhaps make sense, and it is in this sense that some historians regard this period as the period of economy where state is very tightly regulating every aspect of economy, to the extent that it is having a tight control over irrigation channels, and it is through that control that it is levying taxes, and this is how state is controlling or regulating agricultural activities and so forth. Kautilya also tells us about Durg Nivesh or Durg Vidhan, which is founding of walled towns, not by the priests, nobles and soldiers as was the practice earlier, but also by the artisans, also by the merchants and several other sections. So again, it is the state making effort to found new towns with the effort of the artisans, merchants and others. The intent, of course, is to be able to generate more tax from the people who are residing in these towns. So, because Kautilya also mentions that towns, that is Durg, and the countryside, which is referred to as a Rashtra, as the two chief sources of income to the state. And there is this sense of maximizing the number of Durg or towns so that the tax can also be maximized. And since it's all being done at the behest of the state, so obviously one can presume fairly overriding presence of the state even in terms of taxing it or regulating the economy. As I said in the earlier part of the discussion, that our information related to Mauryan economy is not only numerous but also more credible, and this credibility comes by establishing correspondence between what is described in one source and what comes from an unconnected another source. So if you read Kautilya's description of state officials and try to juxtapose that with the one coming from Megasthenes, there is fair degree of correspondence. So we get to hear of Parnyadhyaksh, who probably is what Megasthenes described as officer in charge of the market or commerce. Similarly, we get to hear of Pautavadhyaksh, who probably was the superintendent of weights and measures. We get to hear of Shulkadhyaksh, who supervised tolls, even riverine tolls, so boats and ships coming through waterways. That was also taxed at the entry point or at the ports, entry point of the cities or even ports, etc. We get to hear of Sutradhyaksha, who probably was associated with looking after weaving operations, so into textile and so forth, income generated from this segment of economy. So what we get to see, and this runs across almost 30 odd economic domains. There's tax on salt making, there's tax on mining that we shall be talking about later. So 30 odd economic segments are being very tightly supervised under the eyes of the state. There are specific officials for that. And therefore, the image that one gets is that of state's virtual monopoly in several segments, say in liquor production, consumption, and also salt production and consumption. So, That is the dominant picture that we get from Kautilya and Megasthenes and so forth with respect to what was happening in relation to economy in the Mauryan period. Kautilya further refers to Akaradhyaksh, superintendent of mines. We have literary evidence of gold, copper, silver, lead, tin, iron, bitumen. They are all referred to as metals, as resources in literary sources of the period. Archaeologically, some of them have been attested also, having been mined during the period. So mining of gold and copper is very much attested during the period. And probably other metals that are referred to in the literary sources. There were officials looking after it, trying to supervise it, trying to make some, trying to levy some tax on activities associated with these segments. For example, there is Lohadhyaksh, as the name itself suggests that it is about regulating iron production, its distribution, taxation, so forth. There is Khanyadhyaksh, which is looking after the mining activities or that domain of economic activity. Lavanadhyaksh, salt. Lakshanadhyaksh, who is looking after a range of activities, elements, whether they are fit to be taxed or the kind of distinction, differentiation that can be made. Kautilya emphasizes that treasury has its origin in mining and force, that is dand. This is how earth is acquired. Now, such references tell us as to what is the instruction, implicit instruction for the state, that it builds the force, the human apparatus, the administrative apparatus, to create this sense of punishment if tax rates are not complied with. And it is directly intervening in economic activities as mining and trying to have some kind of a monopoly over, say, iron mining or some rare metal mining or some high value metals and so forth. And as we have discussed earlier, that over and above this reference, we also have a policy that is putting extra pressure on the Mauryan administration to maximize its revenue, and that policy is that of depositing half the income as insurance against emergencies. So it is not only for day-to-day expenditure of administration and army and so forth, but also the buffer, which is to the tune of half the tax amount or half the exchequer, that is supposed to be kept safe in case things go wrong, in case emergencies require, eating into those buffer. So that also had to be kept, and therefore there is an increased pressure, compulsion on the state to maximize revenue. And this gives us a feeling as if the whole economy of the country during the period was geared to the financial needs of the state, and there is hardly anything beyond the domain of the state in terms of economic activity. This is further attested by distribution pattern of Ashokan edicts, which is almost distributed all across the empire, with more concentration on nodal points, which are also the areas where trade activities are amplified and so forth, or river valleys and so forth. So there is some engagement of the state, or there is maximized evidence of state material remains wherever there is more economic activity happening. The same holds true with the distribution pattern of northern black polished ware, which is again argued to have its epicenter in the Middle Gangetic Valley, and perhaps it is through the movement of people, it could be monks, merchants, and even monarch, that northern black polished ware now gets to be seen subsequently in other areas of the empire also. So all these things are cited as points in favor of the centralized model of the Mauryan economy. Now, over and beyond this, over the last 3-4 decades, we also get to hear of several scholars who have started questioning this acute, centralized, bureaucratized model of Mauryan economy, and they rather say that it's better that we start understanding the nature of sources. For example, Kautilya's Arthashastra, not as a descriptive text, but as prescriptive text. So what do we mean here? What we mean is Kautilya's Arthashastra tells us about the ideal type of state system that should be there, and it is not describing things the way it existed. And that's one point that the proponents of decentralized models say. Then there is another argument made by scholars which tell us about differential control and chronologically staggered secondary state formation in Deccan and South India, southern part of India. Now, what do we mean by this? It is like the concern of the state in an empire like that of the Mauryas differed region-wise. So, the areas which is close to the metropolitan state or the capital, Pataliputra, the present-day Patna, those areas, of course, is administered more intensively, is taxed more intensively. Surrounding that area is the core area. Enveloping the nuclear area is the core area, where also there is fair degree of administrative and fiscal presence of the state, and there is this will to control economy and administration in a tight way. But beyond those areas where the population itself is not very dense, where economy is not still to the stage where it could be taxed perpetually and so forth. So those areas are referred to as peripheral areas, and concern of the state from the peripheral areas would be different. So occasionally the state would go and transact some business, as could have happened, say, with respect to gold mining from Kolar area, Karnataka area. We don't know much about the state of human activity or political activity or the extent of market development around this area. We don't know about the local people who were transacting this business with the Mauryan officials and so forth. There is no perceptible presence of these officials in these areas either. So, that means that the model that we should have to make sense of the Mauryan economy should be a decentralized model with differential control depending on the population, the state of economy, the level of economy, what degree of agriculture is being carried out and so forth, and then subsequently also the model which says that what happened in North India, in Gangetic plains in the later Vedic time in 6th century BCE with reference to state formation, Janapad and Mahajanapad formation. Similar kind of transformational change with respect to state formation is happening in other areas, say in Deccan, in eastern part of India, in areas down south. And that has to be understood in that sense that those local areas are developing that capacity, that economic wherewithal to generate that much of surplus which can sustain a state apparatus of their own with the ruling stratum coming from the population of that area only. So that is the stage of state formation, which some historians also label as secondary state formation for these areas. So it has to be understood in that context, and not uncritically as a homogeneous control, very tight control and management of economy and administration under the Mauryas from one metropolis situated in Pataliputra, and there is no differentiation with respect to geography or social and historical development in different areas. So these are the ways and models that can be deployed, that has been deployed by historians to make sense of what was the state of economy during the Mauryan period, which is from the, say, 4th century BCE to around 2nd century BCE. Thank you.